Test one, two, three.
Question for the AV team.
2, 1, live. Mu'mineen, salamun alaykum jami'an wa rahmatullah. For the last several weeks, the coronavirus has been the primary subject of discussion in the media. As of this afternoon, the World Health Organization's reporting indicated there have been over 2.3 million confirmed cases worldwide and almost 158,000 deaths. In Canada, there have been 34,000 cases and 1,500 deaths. And while comparisons have been made to other illnesses and rates of morbidity and mortality, there's no denying that this pandemic has brought the world to its knees. There have been ongoing discussions about flattening the curve and when the spread of the virus will peak. The announcement earlier today by the Ministry of Health here in Ontario has indicated that the public health measures and the physical distancing measures are working, and the sacrifices we're making are beginning to make a difference. The exception, however, remains with the spread in long-term care homes and other group settings. The elderly and those with underlying medical problems like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, chronic respiratory disease, and cancer continue to remain the most vulnerable. However, those who do not fall into these categories are not immune either. And the best way to prevent and slow down transmission is to continue to be well informed about the COVID-19 virus, the disease it causes and how it spreads, and more importantly, to continue to follow the public health guidelines. And to that end, we are honored to have a distinguished panel of doctors for you this evening. Dr. Khalil Sivji, Dr. Fatima Kamalia, and Dr. Shabir Alibai. The first speaker for tonight is Dr. Sivji. Originally from Mombasa, Kenya, Dr. Khalil Sivji grew up in Connecticut and was an active member of the Shia Ithna Ashari Jamaat of New York for many years. He completed his medical training in internal medicine at Yale and then did a fellowship in pulmonary and critical care medicine at Cornell Medical Center. And after moving to Toronto in 2005, he joined the staff at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center, where he was the head of respirology. Currently, he is the medical director of Cleveland Clinic Canada, as well as chief medical director for Royal Bank of Canada. Within the ISIJ, Dr. Sivji has been the co-chair of the Health and Wellness Board and is a member of the COVID-19 task force. Dr. Sivji has been an invaluable guide on the task force, and we're grateful for his continued counsel. And with that introduction, I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Khalil Sivji.
Okay, so I'll unmute and share my screen. And let's see if this works. Okay. Let me just start my PowerPoint. Okay. So thank you for that introduction, Brother Akil. And also thank you for all that you've done for the community. I've seen you work hard when the centers are open and the programs are happening. And I've seen you work even harder now that the centers are closed and we're on a virtual platform. So thank you for all that you do for us. Assalamu alaikum to all those who have joined us tonight. I'm humbled to be on the same panel as Dr. Alibai and Dr. Kamalia, who are both excellent clinicians and who take great care of our seniors and our children, respectively. I will make my comments brief so that we can get to the other presentations and to the Q&A as quickly as possible. My goal in the next few minutes will be to, one, present a quick review about the science behind COVID-19. And I promise to be light on the science, but I think there are a few aspects about the virus that we must all understand to help us understand why these strategies and protective things have been implemented to keep us all safe. I'll then talk about how this virus is spread from person to person. I'll take a step back at that point and review the Canadian journey with COVID-19. And lastly, I'll be reviewing what we know, what we're learning, and some myths that many of you might have seen about COVID-19. So a little bit of science. So it's called the coronavirus because it's a round shell, and that comes from the corona radiata of the sun. When the sun is eclipsed, it looks like a sphere, a bright sphere. That's where that name comes from. It's a coronavirus, much like coronaviruses we've seen in the past and coronaviruses we'll see in the future. It's just that this particular one is a novel coronavirus, or a new one, because it has a protein on this shell. And if you see the things on this picture in blue, that is the protein on the outside of this cell. And that protein, which is called the spike protein, helps the coronavirus land on the cells in the lungs and the airways, puncture a hole in those cells, and start to enter the cell and duplicate itself. Once the cell is full of new coronavirus, the cell bursts and then infects the adjacent cells. Once a person is infected with the virus, they start to have fever, cough, shortness of breath, and other symptoms. And they'll spread the virus then to other people nearby. Now, the good news is that 98% of people that are infected will fully recover. And they'll also make antibodies. And I have a picture of it's actually a Zika virus, if you remember that from last year, with antibodies which are in the shape of a Y attached to it. And those antibodies may attack this coronavirus, call other cells to come in, other immune cells, and kill the virus. So we watch out for antibodies and the development of antibodies and the science behind antibodies over the next several weeks. I said 98% of people infected recover. Unfortunately, 2% do not. They get very sick, some end up in the ICU, and some will die. And among those are the people whose immune system is not what it used to be, and those are our seniors. And so in our strategies, both within the community and in the hospitals and in the clinics, protection of our seniors becomes our #1 priority. So how does the coronavirus spread? Well, here, this cartoon depicts exactly how it happens. The person silhouetted in black is the person who has the virus, is coughing or sneezing. And you can see the respiratory droplets that are coming out of that person, many of them landing on the ground and landing on surfaces. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And many of them reaching the second person who is at the 2-meter mark, landing on their hands. And the second person will then touch their face, touch their eyes, touch their nose, for example, and spread the virus to them, and the cycle continues. I said I would talk a little bit about surfaces. The respiratory droplets containing the coronavirus will sometimes land on surfaces and can last there for up to 4 hours. If the surface is porous like cloth, then the respiratory droplet will dry out and the virus will die. However, on surfaces like plastic and stainless steel, or other hard surfaces like door handles, for instance, the surface may last longer. The other thing I want to mention here is that while this person appears to be ill, the person outlined in black, and is coughing respiratory droplets, the day before they start having symptoms, they may also be spewing out these respiratory droplets, what we call asymptomatic transmission. And we've learned that from studying the people coming off of the cruise ships that have all been tested as they come off these cruise ships you've heard about with lots of people with the virus. And they found that the day before they get sick, those people have a high level of virus in their mouth, in their nose, and so could potentially be spreading the virus that way. So let me talk about the Canadian journey of COVID-19. And I'll start back here in December 2019, when China started reporting an increased number of pneumonias that they couldn't find the reason people were having the pneumonias, and they suspected it was from a new virus, which they finally identified and isolated. By January, by New Year's, there were 300 total cases, and we had the first case in Canada in late January. By February, I addressed the community and told everyone we had 80,000 cases, mostly in Asia, some in Iran, and some in parts of Italy. But at that time, there were only 10 cases in Canada. And recommendations were made to quarantine travelers who were coming back from Asia, Iran, and Italy, but nothing really more than that. In March of 2020, the ISIJ, I think, made the brilliant call to close the centers very early on March 3rd. And I think that singular decision probably saved many lives. And I'll tell you why. Because if you look what happened during March, we went from 24 cases in Canada at the beginning of March to 19,000 cases by the end of March. And that's where we started seeing the travel restrictions and the shutdowns of everything except non-essential services. So where are we today, April 20th? We have 2.5 million cases around the world, as Brother Akil mentioned. In Canada, we have 37,000 cases. The good news is that we've seen a stabilization of the number of daily new cases at around 1,500, and a stabilization in the number of cases in Ontario of about 500. And I speak to my colleagues that work in the hospital, and they tell me as well that the number of hospital admissions of people with COVID is starting to stabilize, the number in the ICU is starting to stabilize, and the number of deaths is starting to stabilize. So we may be at the plateau of the worst of it. However, I want to emphasize that a lot more work is to be done. So I'll end by reviewing this chart about what we know, what we're learning, and some myths. So what we know that the virus is spread by close contacts and by your hands mostly. So hand washing is absolutely critical. We know the best defense then is hand washing, avoiding touching your face, and physically distancing. And we use the 2 meters or 6 feet based on what we know about the respiratory droplets. And we know that these things, hand washing and distancing, save lives. There's no doubt about that. What we're learning is that covering your face with your sleeve or a mask or a facial covering may lower the spread of the droplets, but we don't know how much that contributes. There are countries that have done that have had great success, but they've done other things like testing a lot more people than we're testing. We also know that we make antibodies, those Y-shaped things that I showed you in the first slide, after we are exposed to the virus. But we don't know, is that good enough? How protective are these antibodies? And that'll be very, very important to learn over the next several weeks to months. We know that seniors, and we'll hear more about the seniors' challenges from Dr. Alibai, are at higher risk of serious illness, and we need to learn how do we best protect them. Of course, we cannot keep seniors indoors and away from social gatherings forever. So we need to know, how do we best protect our seniors? And we need to learn more about medications. There have been other medications such as hydroxychloroquine. There's an antiviral, azithromycin. There are a lot of medications that have been purported to help. We have to remember that none of them are proven, and many of them have side effects that sometimes might be worse than the virus itself. And we need to stay away from myths that we see in social media, like to kill COVID-19, gargle with salt water. That does not kill the virus. It makes our throat feel better, and it makes, if you have a sore throat or you're coming out with a cold for another reason, sure, go ahead. There isn't any harm, but it's not going to cure us of COVID-19. And neither are hand dryers or hair dryers blown into the nose or the throat. Other dangerous myths out there is that to detect if you have COVID-19, you should hold your breath for 10 seconds or test your smell some soap or some coffee. And if you can smell it, then you don't have the virus. That too is untrue. We know some people do lose their sense of smell when they have the virus, but the only test for the virus that's reliable is the nasopharyngeal swab, where they put the Q-tip in your nose and test for the virus. So I want to end my part of the presentation by sharing one of my favorite sayings by Imam Ali, which is, the one who has the most blessed life is the one who supports others during their life. I thought that was a beautiful saying by Imam Ali alayhi salam. I think this quote is a reflection of the heartwarming behaviors we have seen from many members of our community, as they have done and continue to do so much to help one another through these difficult times. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Brother Akil.
Thank you, Dr. Sivaji, for your presentation. Inshallah, we'll have an opportunity to ask him some questions towards the end of the session. Our next speaker for this evening is Dr. Fatima Kamalia. Dr. Kamalia graduated from Queen's University Medical School and then obtained her pediatric fellowship from the Hospital for Sick Children. She owns a private practice in Thornhill and is an attending staff in the Department of Pediatrics at Mackenzie Health Hospital. She's also an affiliate staff at the Hospital for Sick Children. She's a registration examiner and a peer examiner for the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. She's also on the board of directors for the IMI and is on the ISIJ Strategic Planning Committee. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Kamalia.
Assalamu alaikum. I want to thank the ISIJ as well as Brother Akil for inviting me to speak today. And thank you, Dr. Sivji, for those kind words, as well as an excellent summary and introduction to COVID-19. So my talk is going to be very specific in that I'm going to spend about 10 minutes to discuss pediatrics and COVID-19. And then, of course, after Dr. Alibai's talk, we'll have some time for question and answers. So my objectives for the next 10 minutes is to discuss the incidence of COVID-19 in the pediatric population, the presentation or how children present with COVID-19, helping you identify the children who are at high risk, discussing a little bit about COVID-19 in newborns and breastfeeding mothers, talking to you about how you can discuss COVID-19 with your children of all ages, as well as recommendations that I give my patients about things they should be doing while they're at home in social isolation. So a little bit about the incidence of COVID-19, particularly in the pediatric population. So the good news is children generally do not do very well if they contract this virus. The risk of contracting this virus in children is very low. So children make up a very small percentage of all confirmed cases of COVID-19 worldwide, and they only make up 2%. The children that actually do contract this illness, the vast majority do incredibly well, and only 1% are severely affected and require hospitalization. Out of that 1%, less than 0.5% actually end up in the intensive care unit. So that is amazing statistics for children, unlike the elderly. Children between 10 and 18 years, so i.e. your pre-adolescent and adolescent children, are the most likely to become infected. And males seem to be infected just slightly more than women or females at 57%. As of today, the statistics for the Hospital for Sick Children is that they've had 0 admitted patients with COVID-19. They have had just under a dozen who've been diagnosed with COVID-19, and all of those have been in their outpatient clinics, so were discharged home. So once again, the good thing is in the pediatric population, children generally don't contract COVID-19, and those that do seem to do exceedingly well. Now, the only problem is that children are vectors for spreading and transmitting this virus to others, particularly their elderly grandparents. So as Dr. Sivji mentioned, it is very important for us to continue to practice social isolation and social distancing until further advised. So what are the common presentations of COVID-19 in children? So children generally, like I said, present with very mild symptoms. And amongst those symptoms, the commonest features are mild respiratory symptoms. The commonest feature of all is a dry cough. The next commonest feature is fever, and that can be a low-grade fever or a high-grade fever. Children in general do not present like adults in that they do not get chest pain, they do not get shortness of breath, and they do not have difficulty with oxygen exchange or hypoxemia. Children also present with a number of very vague symptoms, such as fatigue or tiredness, generalized headaches, muscle aches or body aches, and some can present with abdominal symptoms, such as mild tummy aches or diarrhea. Recently, Sick Kids has released a couple of features which are considered very atypical, and this was released by the dermatology department as findings with kids who have COVID-19, and these have been the presenting features in kids who have been asymptomatic, meaning that they've had 0 symptoms except these particular findings, which are called chilblains or chilburns. And these typically present on the toes, but can present on the fingers also. And it's essentially tissue damage from damage to the capillaries, and that causes some redness, some swelling, some inflammation, some itching, and some blisters. This particular illness is self-resolving, So you do not have to do much for it. But once again, it seems to be one of the atypical features or findings in children who are testing positive for COVID-19. And once again, this does not mean that your child is going to be more severely affected by it. It's just a finding to indicate that you should have your child assessed or possibly tested, because once again, we want to make sure that they do not spread it to others, particularly the more vulnerable people. Okay, so who are the high-risk children? There's 3 categories for high-risk children. The first is your child who has any sort of underlying or chronic medical condition, such as a premature infant, an asthmatic who's quite severe, a child who has any kind of heart or cardiac disease, a child with diabetic, a child with cancer, and children who have any kind of immunodeficiencies or autoimmune disorders. The second category is young children, and generally that's considered under the age of 4 months because they have poor immunity. And the final category is a child who's on medications. So once again, generally speaking, a chronic child who requires ongoing medications, particularly immunosuppressive drugs and high-dose steroids, which we use for a number of conditions. So it is really important, particularly at a time like this, to make sure that you maintain your child's routine visits, particularly vaccinations, and do not be afraid to bring your child in if they need vaccinations, because most pediatricians in the GTA are actually in their offices for particular days, seeing and assessing children who need healthy baby exams and who need their vaccines. Most pediatricians throughout the rest of the week are working virtually, so you can always have your pediatrician assess you in that means to tell you if you need vaccines or not. Okay, so a little bit about COVID-19 and newborn babies and breastfeeding mothers. So the good news once again is that there's presently no evidence suggesting that healthy pregnant women are at a higher risk of becoming seriously ill from COVID-19. There is also currently no evidence of mother-to-child transmission through childbirth. And lastly, COVID-19 has not been found in breast milk of infected mothers. So that is excellent news, because what that means is if a mother is infected with COVID-19, the likelihood is that she will be fine, because most healthy pregnant women do just fine. She'll deliver a baby with no transmission of the virus to the child, and she can breastfeed the child, which is still the recommendation, because the virus does not transmit itself through the breast milk. However, there are a few things she needs to take into consideration. The first thing is she needs to wear a mask whenever she's around the baby, because she can shed the infection to the born child. Secondly, it is recommended that the child remain covered at all times with a blanket. Thirdly, as Dr. Sivji mentioned, it is really important for her to maintain good respiratory hygiene and good hand hygiene, meaning the washing of the hands often, especially before and after touching her baby, before and after feeding her baby, and especially before and after changing the baby's diapers, because the virus can shed in stool. And lastly, she should ensure that the environment she puts the baby on or she's around is clean and disinfected often and continuously. Lastly, visitors, as exciting a time as childbirth is, should be restricted from visiting the home of newborn babies. Okay, so the next 2 slides is what I want to spend the majority of my time on. And the first one is how to talk to children about COVID-19. So I've listed 6 things that I suggest as to how to approach this topic. And I think it is important if you have children that you bring up this topic, because even if though they may not, I'm sure they're thinking about it. Depending on the age of your child and the maturity level, obviously the details you discuss can vary, but these are just 6 generalizations or 6 areas I think you should approach. So the first is state facts. Be truthful about what we know and what we don't know about this virus. So as Dr. Sivji mentioned, we already know it's a highly contagious virus. We know how it's spread, and so we know how to prevent its spread both amongst ourselves and to others. We know what population is most vulnerable, and I've just discussed with you how children are not at high risk of catching it or becoming sick, so that can certainly help to reassure your children. Secondly, be honest. Tell them the truth, which is what we know, and that is that none of us can predict what we expect over the next few months. Dr. Sivji mentioned we might be seeing a plateauing, so that alhamdulillah is excellent news, but at the same time, information can change on a weekly or monthly basis. So continually keep them updated and be honest with them. Also tell them that we know for a fact that at some point we will overcome this virus. And how can I say that with such certainty? Well, because if you look at our past history with previous pandemics, we've eventually eradicated them. And you can talk to your children about the previous pandemics and let them learn a little bit and understand that even though all of these were quite severe illnesses and took many lives, eventually we eradicated them, either through vaccination or other means. And you can talk to them about the numerous plagues that happened in the 1600s. Then in the 1800s, we had cholera, the Spanish flu, and the Asian flu. And then in the 1980s, we had HIV and SARS. And in the 1990s, we had Ebola and MERS. And now in 2019, 2020, we have COVID-19. Thirdly, help alleviate their fears. Now, you can only alleviate their fears if you know what their fears are. So specifically ask your child what the concerns are, what they're fearful about. You might be surprised that they're fearful of something that you didn't anticipate. And once you open the doors for communication, you can have a much better understanding of how to address their concerns. Fourthly, and this is a very important point, I suggest you limit their TV and social media, especially to fake news. Nowadays, almost every child has some sort of an iPhone, some sort of an iPad, and they have instant access to information, particularly to sites like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, WhatsApp groups, and a lot of these give very scary and not necessarily accurate information. Instead, I suggest you rely on sources where the information is credible and accurate, such as CTV, news stations, CNN, BBC, the World Health Organization reports, CDC reports, WebMD, and of course, our Jamaat news and webinars. Lastly, and very importantly, do fun things with your children. Eat together, exercise together, pray together, play together. When they see you engaging and doing things with them and they see that you feel well and you're active and you're not scared, it helps alleviate their fears. And most importantly, when they see you being healthy, it takes away the fear that they're going to lose their mommy and daddy anytime soon. And like I mentioned earlier, keep checking in on your children. Make sure that they're feeling okay, make sure that they're coping, and have ongoing discussions as new information is presented to us. Okay, finally, I want to talk about some recommendations that I give my patients on what they should do while they're at home in social isolation. So right now, children and parents have a lot of free time on their hands, and I don't like any of them just idling away this abundance of time. So there's 7 recommendations that I make for my patients. The first is they should all try to get enough sleep. And when I say enough sleep, the average recommended sleep is around 8 to 9 hours for most children. So I recommend that they have structure to their days. Weekends can be exceptional, but I like them waking up at a certain time of the day, every day, and going to sleep at a certain time of the day, and structuring certain things within the day that I'll discuss with you. Next, I like them eating healthy. So if you heard Dr. Anar Aladina's talk last Monday, she had a whole session on healthy eating. And in that, she discussed details. So essentially, you want them eating whole foods. You want them eating a variety of healthy foods, fresh fruits, drinking lots of water, avoiding pop and juice, and really minimizing junk food. As parents, you're the ones that buy the food and prepare the food. So you have the majority of control in ensuring that your children are eating healthy. And right now, we all have time for cooking, which we may not have had prior. Thirdly, I like children keeping up with their schoolwork and maintaining their academic commitments. They only need to spend a couple of hours a day, and if they've completed all their homework, I recommend they try to get ahead. So once again, schedule in a certain amount of time where they just work on homework, whether it's finishing their present work or getting ahead. Fourthly, I like them exercising every single day. Right now, there's no excuse that there's no time. On average, I like children spending at least 30 minutes on exercise, where I want their heart rate to go up, I want them sweating, and I want them actually getting a good workout. And certainly they can spend more than 30 minutes, but that's the minimum amount recommended. Children who like playing sports can continue to modify that. For example, if you have a basketball net in your front garage driveway, get a basketball and start shooting hoops. You can even play 21 with your children. If you have a baseball glove and a ball, play in your backyard and play some catch. You can go for walks every day. The weather's improving, so that's a great idea to get some fresh air, get some vitamin D, have some time with nature. And if you don't have a lot of access because the weather is cold, I know it's gotten warmer now, you can skip rope in your basement, you can skip rope in your backyard, you can stay indoors doing a variety of various activities that you can do on your own, such as burpees, jumping jacks, mountain climbers, planks, You can do yoga, you can do Pilates. There's a host of things you can do, but the idea is just keep yourself moving for 30 minutes minimum and build up a nice sweat. And this is a great thing you can do with your children to maintain good health. Fifth, number 5, and this is really important with Ramadan coming up towards the end of this week, I want them to spend some time with religion and spirituality. Right now, everyone should be able to pray the salat on time. There's really no reason why we shouldn't when we're at home. I also want children starting to read the Quran if they haven't already, with Ramadan coming up, as I mentioned, and reciting some du'as, watching some religious movies or lectures from any of the Maulanas that you enjoy, reading religious books. I've always enjoyed the Prophet Yusuf series, as well as they can spend some time on their own meditation and developing a connection between Allah and themselves. Number 6, I want them to have a little bit of time for leisure. Now, when I say leisure, I don't mean sitting in front of a TV and watching 3 hours of mindless TV. Instead, I want them to find a hobby that they've always had an interest in, or something new that they can develop an interest in. And there's a variety of things. So I've just mentioned a few. They can read. In fact, there's a site that I've listed there that allows you to have books read to your child. So it's called Stories Audible. And I've actually seen a Harry Potter series on there. You can do some virtual tours, and I've listed the site for that, for museums and other monuments. Dr. Sirji told me that him and his daughters visited the Louvre and he loved it. So that's a site you can visit. There's courses more for older children, so teenagers, and the courses are free through Harvard University and Yale on mindfulness and other books that older kids would like to read to enhance their knowledge. And then you can always learn a new language. You can Google it. You can go online if you want to learn Spanish or French or improve your Gujarati or Urdu or Kutchi. You can take up photography, right? We talked about going outdoors, getting some vitamin D, so enjoy nature. And lastly, you can always polish up your cooking and baking skills. Lastly, I want children helping their parents around the house. I want them helping to clean their rooms. I want them helping to vacuum, dust, help prepare the meals, help set the table, and finally help cleaning the table. So at a time like this, I believe we all need some inspiration. So what I want everyone to do is focus on the journey and not the destination. We are presently in a position of something we have never experienced, but we can make the best out of it by realizing that we have a path ahead of us and we have the ability to form how we want this path to evolve. There's no need to get anxious. Inshallah, this will come to an end at some point. We may not know when, but we know it will. And by listening to the health authorities and maintaining social isolation and physical distance, we will help this virus come to an end sooner. So that was most of what I wanted to say, and I'll pass it on to Brother Akil.
Thank you, Dr. Kamalia, for that detailed presentation. I think some of those recommendations on that final slide are applicable not only to children, but also to adults, I'm sure. This session, by the way, is being recorded, and therefore, if you want to go back and refer to some of the recommendations that Dr. Kamalia has made, the presentation will be available because it is being recorded. It will be available, inshallah, probably shortly after we conclude the session tonight. Our final speaker for this evening is Dr. Alibai. Dr. Shabir Alibai is a professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Toronto. He completed medical school in 1993 and specialized in internal medicine and geriatric medicine, which focuses on frail and medically complex older adults. He's a staff physician and senior scientist in the Division of General Internal Medicine and Geriatrics at the University Health Network and Mount Sinai Hospital. His research interests are in cancer and older adults. He also has a long-standing interest in Islamic bioethics at the end of life. With that introduction, I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Alibai.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Thank you, Brother Akil, and thank you to the Jamaat for inviting me. Thank you also to Dr. Sirji and Dr. Kamalia for setting the stage and talking about a lot of the important elements around COVID-19 and how we need to prepare ourselves. My focus is going to be on older adults. And what I hope to cover in the next 10 to 12 minutes are some details about the risks of COVID-19 in seniors particularly, and why all of us have been emphasizing the need to protect our seniors, and why the story may not be such a good news story in older adults as it is in children or in middle-aged adults who are healthy. I'll talk about health safety and ways in which we can try and minimize the risk to ourselves, and talk very briefly about boosting our immune system to help our bodies to become stronger and be ready to reduce the risk of infection and help us fight infection should we get COVID-19 or any other infections as we get older. I'll spend a couple of minutes on mental well-being and mental health and keeping our mind strong, and then end off with some resources that may be important to seniors in our community. And I had the privilege just recently of speaking to our seniors on behalf of the Jamaat. Sister Shirin Bhamani invited me to speak, and I was able to speak to them in Gujarati. So for those who heard this talk, a lot of it is a repetition of what I said previously, but it's much more condensed today. So apologies if you've heard this before. The part that you've not heard very much of is the risks. And unfortunately, as has been alluded to already, this is not a good news story for seniors. This is not a common cold. This is not even the flu. And remember that although most people who get COVID-19 will have mild flu-like symptoms or no symptoms at all, for example, young children may have very, very mild symptoms and they will recover in a few days, seniors are at risk. I'll show you some data in just a moment. Seniors are at risk because with aging, every single organ system in our bodies starts to get a little bit weaker, and it gets weaker with every year that we get older. And that starts at about age 40, unfortunately. So many of us are getting a little bit weaker now, but certainly when you get into your 60s and 70s, it becomes much more pronounced. The immune system gets weaker, our lungs become weaker, the heart becomes weaker, our muscles become weaker, etc. And each one of these organs and tissues and parts of our body are needed when it's under stress, like with an infection. Not only are seniors at increased risk, but if you combine that with medical illness like asthma, emphysema, or people who smoke, they're at even higher risk than just being older. And so it's important even if you're a healthy older adult, but it's even more risky if you have one or more of these medical illnesses. And many older adults do have one or more medical illnesses, and so they have to be particularly careful. I'm not here to scare you, but I do want you and the loved ones that you have who are older adults to be aware that this is a serious illness for older adults. And for now, we have no cure. We have no vaccine, and so prevention is key. Let's look at some recent data from the United States, which is not that different from our country and our experience. So for example, among older adults, age 65 and older, who were infected with a proven infection with COVID-19. So based on blood tests or based on the swab that Dr. Sivji talked about, 31 to 59% of people aged 65 to 84 needed to be hospitalized, and 31 to 70% of people between ages 85 and older who had COVID-19 infection needed hospitalization. So roughly 1 in 2. And of those people who got sick and had infection, 11 to 31% of those who are 65 to 84-year-old ended up in the intensive care unit, and similar numbers ended up in the intensive care unit for those who are aged 85 and older. And why the number for 85 and older is not higher is because in many places, these seniors refused to go to the ICU, or the doctors in the hospitals did not have capacity in some parts of the United States, and so they preferentially took younger people to the ICU and not older people. And I'm not focusing on the ethics of that, but just keep that in mind. It's not that the older adults don't have a higher risk of going to the ICU. And sadly, of those people who got infected who are over the age of 65, 4 to 11% died. And the rates are even higher among those who are 85 and older. So this is a serious illness in older adults, and it kills people. It kills a lot of older adults, particularly those in nursing homes, as I'm sure we've all seen the terrible stories in the media in Canada in the last few weeks. So let's talk about health safety. Prevention is the key. You've already heard about this, and there's no harm in repeating it, but really the key principles of prevention. Wash your hands frequently with good soap and water for 15 to 20 seconds, or an alcohol-based hygiene solution that has 60% alcohol in it or greater. Stay indoors as much as possible and minimize contact with other people outside your home, including the grandchildren who you love, and I'm sure who love you and want to see you. But even though they may feel well, they have a risk of bringing the infection to you, and you have a very high risk of getting sick. Physical distancing has been emphasized over and over again, and it is the key strategy to help prevent infection in seniors. Avoiding crowds, staying 6 feet away if you have to go out, and if you don't have to go out, then stay indoors or be in your backyards and avoid being around anybody, particularly anyone who's sick. Keep your distance as much as possible. And also, as a practical tip, make sure you have enough of your medications, because you may not be going to the pharmacy regularly, your family may not be able to come regularly, and not all pharmacies deliver, and you certainly don't want to run out in the middle of the night when you can't get your medications. If you get symptoms of a chest infection, and as Dr. Kamalia mentioned, the symptoms in younger and older adults are sometimes different from the average middle-aged adult, but the majority of older adults who get sick will get a low-grade fever, sometimes high-grade, but even 37.5 measured by mouth is considered a fever, and one needs to be alerted to this, or they get a cough or shortness of breath. And many people will get all three of these. Some people will get headaches or other symptoms as well. These are the key symptoms of this infection, but they also overlap a lot with other infections, such as the flu and such as the common cold. So one needs to be very careful. And if you're feeling at all sick, you really need to get a hold of someone. You don't have to go to the emergency room. There are lots of opportunities to be able to speak to someone on the phone or by video, such as your family doctor, or contacting the public health unit to figure out, do you need to go and be tested in a COVID-19 screening center, or do you even need to call 911 or go to the emergency room? And this last category, people who have severe symptoms or are advised to go by a healthcare professional, are really the only ones who need to go to the emergency room. But sadly, that will include a number of seniors who get sick. So obviously, the best thing to do is to prevent getting sick in the first place, if at all possible. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go into specific strategies to boost the immune system, but alhamdulillah, other members of our community have spoken about this. So I'll just take a minute to remind you that we can boost our immune system with good nutrition that helps us to fight infection with a variety of vitamins and minerals in our bodies. And there was a talk by Sister Anara Lidina that was already alluded to by Dr. Kamalia, in which she talked about a number of foods that boost the immune system, the importance of drinking liquids and staying hydrated, a variety of foods of different colors and all their benefits to help us. And remember that seniors tend to get dehydrated more easily than younger adults, especially with a low-grade fever, especially when the weather gets warmer. And so making sure you're drinking 1 to 1.5 liters of fluid a day, so that's 4 to 6 glasses of 8-ounce glasses of liquids, which is water, milk, juice, or soup. Coffee and tea generally don't count because they cause some water loss because of the caffeine. And I'll just make one quick point about vitamins, and I'll talk more about that in the question period if people want. But most older adults who eat a balanced diet do not need to take vitamins, in particular vitamin C, which may sound like a wonderful idea, but there's really no good data that vitamin C helps in the setting of preventing COVID-19 infection. Exercise is also really important to help keep your body fit. It boosts the immune system, it keeps your muscles strong, it reduces fatigue and increases one's energy, and it can help with our mental health. And once again, we are blessed in this community to have a number of exercise professionals, and a great talk a couple of days ago by Sister Zahar Ali Bhai, who I encourage all of you to listen to understand about the different elements of exercise, how much you should exercise, the stretching part, the aerobic or cardio component, and the resistance exercises or weightlifting that can really help to keep us fit for various stresses on our body, including infection. Now, let's end off with a couple of things about mental well-being, and then I'll end with some resources. It's understandable that in times like this, when we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, that people will become stressed or afraid or worried or anxious or even sad in these kinds of times. We miss our families, we miss going outside, we miss going to the mosque, all these things. And these are normal responses when the body and the mind are dealing with stress. But just because they're a normal response doesn't mean they're a healthy response. And so we need to think about ways in which we can stay well mentally and emotionally. And like Dr. Kamalia, I'm going to suggest a couple of things for our seniors. I'm sure they apply not just to seniors, but they apply to you and me as well. But we need to stick to routines and schedules so that there's a sense of normality in our lives and that we don't feel like our lives have been turned upside down. Because some things are restricted, but we can still do a lot of what we want to do. Spend some time practicing meditation or yoga or other calming strategies, especially with the holy month of Ramadan coming up. Lots of opportunities to earn thawab and ways in which we can relax and get closer to Allah both at the same time. And stay socially connected, especially for our seniors who do not live with their children. It becomes harder because it's just one or two people in the home. And so we need people to talk to. Even as we have less opportunities to talk to people in person, there are so many opportunities to talk to people on the phone and reach out to people you might not talk to on a regular basis, family or friends, locally or internationally, using not just the regular telephone, but WhatsApp video, FaceTime, or other ways in which you can connect with people to stay engaged and socially connected. Because you're not alone, none of us should be alone. Make sure you get the right amount of sleep. Typically for older adults, it's in the range of 7.5 to 9 hours a day. I know there's a lot of changes that occur in the bodies of older adults in terms of sleep, and taking naps is okay, especially in Ramadan when we may be staying up late or waking up for Sahri, but it's important to get enough sleep throughout the day, not necessarily all in one go. Next important thing is to find activities that bring joy or meaning to our lives, because this is important as a way of staying engaged and feeling like you're contributing and not just passing the time, passing the day watching mindless television. Stay active mentally. Make sure that we are grateful, because there are so many blessings we have even in this difficult time. And importantly, just like Dr. Kamali emphasized, take breaks on watching news and television. In particular, I find a number of my patients spend hours and hours watching the news, and it's extraordinarily depressing because all you see is deaths in nursing homes and people who have this and people who have that and all these problems. The news is going to make us all depressed. And yes, we want to stay up to date, but you really don't need more than an hour of news a day. Even that's a lot. Outside of that, try and stay away from the news. Watch a little bit of television, but do other things that are more active in terms of using your mind. And of course, have faith in Allah. A reminder that some of you will still not feel well after doing all these things. And if you feel particularly anxious or sad and don't feel like you want to do anything, you don't feel motivated, this is a time when we need to seek professional help. And that doesn't mean you need to go to the emergency room or even leave your home. There are lots of ways in which you can connect with not only family, but with professional counselors, social workers, or book an appointment online or on the telephone with your family doctor to talk about whether you need to do more than just some of the things I've talked about, whether you have a more serious form of worry or even depression or anxiety, and you may need more professional help. And once again, Dr. Naushad Noorani gave a talk to our community recently on mental well-being in COVID-19, and it's a great talk to follow up on. And the last thing I'll highlight is that we have a lot of resources in this community and outside to help. The Seniors Committee that many of you know of touch base with our seniors on a regular basis and will help organize things for people in need. There are organizations in our community like Because We Care that provides meals and visits to people who need them for different reasons. There are grocery delivery services around Toronto within our community and outside our community. Some of them are getting filled up, but there are also times of day that are dedicated to seniors when you need to go shopping if you have to go out, and try and use those times to go, although I know it's sometimes crowded even then. There are programs that will deliver Meals on Wheels to people at a very cheap price for those who can't get food from family or friends or from this community. But alhamdulillah, most people who need it can get it from within the community, but there are other resources available. There are helplines that are free that give lots of advice on all sorts of aspects of COVID-19. For people who need services at home because they're feeling unwell or they need help and they can't get their usual family to help them with bathing and other day-to-day tasks like getting ready in the morning, there are opportunities to get that through home care or what's called the CCAC or the LIN. And I've given 2 examples of the many, many websites that have information for caregivers, for members of the public, and for healthcare professionals on COVID-19 and seniors. And with that, I'll end. Thank you and salam alaikum.
Thank you, Dr. Alibai, and once again, thank you to all of the doctors who've presented this evening. As you can tell, they've covered a lot of ground and have tried to make their presentations as detailed as possible. Nonetheless, we have begun receiving questions, and what I'd like to do is we'll turn over to try to tackle some of the questions that have been coming in. And I'll try to address them to who I feel is the most appropriate physician to answer the question, but please do feel free to redirect if you feel someone else can answer the question better or add to the answer that you're going to provide. Dr. Suji, this is the sort of the million-dollar question that I'm sure everybody asks you: how long is this pandemic going to last, and will it drag through the summer?
Yeah, so that's a popular question, and there isn't a great answer, because the truth is that a lot of it depends on what we do over the next several weeks. We know that as mentioned, that it appears that the number of new cases is plateauing, and we're not in a state where we're getting more and more cases. So that's great news. But we also know that we don't have an effective treatment, and we don't have an effective vaccination for COVID-19 yet. And vaccinations, people don't realize, typical vaccination development takes 6 to 10 years. So we're trying to use some of the information we got in developing vaccinations against other coronaviruses in the past, like MERS and SARS, take some of that original data and develop a vaccination as fast as possible for COVID-19. But that vaccination is at least 8 to 12 months away. And so unfortunately, we are going to be in a state where we need to still practice these measures to keep people safe, to keep people from transmitting the virus for quite some time now. So it will not be business as usual. It will not be life as it used to be 3 months ago for any time in the foreseeable future. Having said that, as you've heard, and as you've seen in other parts of the world, people are trying now to resume parts of a normal daily routine. So they're starting to open up some schools in Europe. They're starting to open up some shops in Italy. That has to go along with ongoing washing of the hands, ongoing distancing when you can, and testing in those communities. Because if the amount of new cases stays stable when we start to relax some of these measures, then that shows that could be a possibility to relax measures all over for everyone. However, if the number of new cases starts to rise dramatically, the number of hospital admissions starts to rise, the number of deaths starts to rise after relaxing some of these measures, then we may have to step back from that. So we don't know, but we will find out in the next few weeks, because you're going to see some of these restrictions starting to relax.
Thank you. Dr. Alibai, my parents who are elderly don't understand why they should be in isolation, even though we do the groceries for them and get them whatever they need. They want to go outside and they're upset. I know you touched on this a little bit, but perhaps maybe you can shed some more light, or perhaps give them some advice on how, why it is that parents who are elderly should be discouraged to be going outside to do the groceries, and what advice do you give children who have elderly parents?
Thank you. It's a great question, and one that comes up regularly. It's not easy to explain, especially in people who haven't grown up in a period where they've had a lot of exposure to science. What can we say? We can say a couple of things. First of all, it's an invisible enemy. We can't see it. We can't easily measure it. And the best treatment right now is prevention. We have no vaccine, we have no drugs, and we also know the statistics that even older adults who live at home and are otherwise healthy, maybe they're only taking one medication for blood pressure or a medication for diabetes, they are at substantial risk of getting sick if they get the infection, and they are at substantial risk if they get sick of needing to go to hospital, and they may even need to go to the intensive care unit, or they may die. And this is not a trivial risk. And the problem is that there are not a lot of strategies that can reduce that risk. The best strategies include the hand washing and the physical distancing. It's possible to go outside for periods of time for short walks and things, but one needs to be very careful in the communities that one lives in to make sure that that's feasible and one can do it and maintain the appropriate distance. So that may be something they can do, at least, and go out and go for short walks. If they have a backyard, they can be in that area. But grocery shopping and going to malls and things like that, the number of people floating through those spaces, the inability to clean those environments, and the virus may be sitting there for hours or even up to 2 or 3 days, depending on the surface, it means that the risks are enormous. And unfortunately, this is an invisible enemy. And so we really need to be aware of that, even though it may be hard to explain. But this is the strategy that all of the public health authorities and even our ulama and local scholars and public health agencies, everyone's reminding us that this is the best approach. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's really the best way in order to try to keep our risk down. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Dr. Kamalia, you touched on this, but I'm going to ask you again. Can you talk a little bit about distancing with grandchildren and why we should distance ourselves from our grandchildren? Obviously, this is we live in a society, or our culture is such that grandparents are always interacting with their grandchildren, and now all of a sudden grandparents are being asked to stay away from their grandchildren. And it's been like this for several weeks, and who knows how long it's going to continue for. And therefore, it is quite difficult for grandparents to be away from their grandchildren, for grandchildren to be away from their grandparents. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure. So it's a very good question, particularly a very relevant question, and especially for grandparents, because as Dr. Alibai mentioned, sometimes the stress can be alleviated in many ways, and one is just by seeing their grandchildren. So there's many reasons that a grandparent would want to be around their grandchildren and vice versa. And I remember a quote I heard once, and it went as such: if I knew grandchildren were this much fun, I would have had them before my children. So we know how important grandchildren are to their grandparents and vice versa. So children, as I mentioned, seem to be doing extremely well when they catch this virus. They generally don't catch it, and the few that do catch it do very well. Very few end up sick. The problem is these children can present with 0 symptoms, meaning asymptomatic. They can have a slight cough, which seems no different than a common cold or a little virus. They can have a low-grade fever to no fever, and then the fever can disappear. And we know that the virus can persist in your body for days, likely weeks, even after you have no symptoms. So children are known as vectors, meaning they carry this virus and spread it and shed it while they can feel and present perfectly normal. If they meet their grandparents while they're harboring COVID-19, without a question, when they hug, kiss, share things with their grandparents, which is inevitable when you're in close contact, they will spread it to those grandparents, those elderly. And as we've talked about it, Dr. Alibai alluded to it, the elderly are the highest risk, and that's the reason why most of us are preventing exposure, is to protect them, right? That's why the governments have imposed such strict regulations. It's to help the seniors who are the highest and most vulnerable in our population. Now, remember, we have many means in which we can visually see our grandchildren. So certainly you can Skype them, you can Zoom them as we're doing here, you can WhatsApp them, you can find all kinds of, you can telephone call them, all kinds of inventive ways of physically distancing yourself, but visually seeing and hearing them. And I think for now, that's the best approach until things settle. The longer we follow these regulations, the sooner and quicker we will see a plateau and we'll be able to engage with our grandchildren again.
Thank you. Dr. Suji, we hear a lot about, home remedies. You alluded to a couple towards the end of your presentation, home remedies that could perhaps strengthen your immune system or help cure COVID-19. One of the questions that's come in from the audience is, can you kindly let us know if honey and kalonji is black seed works to cure COVID-19? If you can maybe talk just in general about some of these home remedies that people talk about as being cures of COVID-19.
So, you can never be too smart, because many of the therapeutics we use in modern medicine, in fact, came from what used to be thought of as home remedies. A great example of it is a medication to slow the heart rate down called digoxin. It came from digitalis, which came from the foxglove plant, and that was brewed in a tea on the English countryside. And people with fast heart rates would go to a witch and have this tea, and they would cure their fast heart rate. And everyone thought it was false and superstition, and it turned out to be there was an active ingredient in there. So you can never say never is my first part of my answer. However, there are no proven therapies against COVID-19. And so these home remedies of honey and flaxseed or haldi or whatever, as long as they're not harmful, I say, go for it. You use it in moderation, as long as they're not harmful. But do not assume that if you've had a cold and it could be COVID-19, that these things would replace getting tested and making sure that you're taken care of with Western medicines as well.
Thank you. Just got this question in via text message. Can you please ask the doctors if in the month of Ramadan, can we share food with families, like sending food to people's homes without obviously meeting them and observing physical distancing? Is it okay to share food with family or neighbors? Dr. Sivji.
I was hoping you'd pick someone else for that one, but as was mentioned earlier today, the fact is the virus can remain on surfaces, right? What we do know, however, is that it is heat sensitive. So in cooked food, it's very, very unlikely to be on the surface of cooked food. The thing I'd be worried about is two things. One is the packaging that the food is in, and secondly, the delivery method. So you should not be, going to somebody's house to hand them the food. But I think if you were smart and you kept it in a container, left it at their door, stepped away, text them, call them, say that there's food at your door, and then they took the whatever the food was out of the container, washed their hands, of course, and then went to eat the food. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but I will also ask my colleagues to comment.
Sure, I'm happy to add to that. I agree with your answer, Dr. Sivji. The only other thing I'd add is the importance of hand washing in the home that's preparing the food and cleaning surfaces, so that we're regularly cleaning the cooking surfaces, we're regularly washing our hands before we put the food into the oven or whatever other way that we're heating it, and when we're packaging it to send to people, that we're washing our hands along the way. And it sounds a bit obsessive that you're washing and washing and washing, but this is the way that we reduce the virus. And we have studies that have shown that soap and water, when people wash their hands for 15 to 20 seconds and do it properly, and there's videos out there to show us, that will reduce the levels of virus substantially down to close to zero. So I agree with you, but I think adding that piece for the preparers of the food is one thing that I would add.
Thank you both.
Sure, Dr.
Kamalia, please.
So two more points I'd like to add. Of course, first of all, I agree with both Dr. Sivji and Dr. Ali Bai's answers. But remember, the first thing is this is no different than buying prepared food from a restaurant or anywhere else that's takeout. And I know a lot of my medical colleagues who are in hospital all day bring take-home food. So we've had this discussion on many forums. And once again, as long as you follow the recommendations that have been already mentioned by Dr. Sivji, I think it is safe. I would add to that, if it's something that can be reheated, that's a good idea also to help kill the virus. So once again, reheat it, and likely it'll be cold by the time you've picked it up and it's been prepared for the time of iftar. The second thing is just be assured that the person who's sending it is not ill, or no one in the house is. And I think that's common sense. If you're preparing food for someone and you yourself are sick, just be cautious, because could you have a mild case and then you'd be spreading it. So I think those who are being thoughtful and kind enough to make food for others who are fasting, just be sure that while you're preparing the food, you yourself are not sick or anyone in the family is sick at the time.
Thank you. Dr. Alibai, you alluded to hand washing frequently. One of the questions that we've received is that if I'm home all day and I don't venture outside, should I still be washing my hands frequently while I'm at home?
So it's a great question. And in an ideal world, if you knew exactly what was coming into your home and everywhere that things were in your home and you had full control, then as soon as you come in, if you wash, and before you leave, when you wash, you would be fine. The problem is most households are not so perfect. You may bring groceries in, there may be plastic bags delivering food, other things that are surfaces on which the virus can reside or live. And so ideally, unless you have absolute control over everything that moves around in your home, it is still a good idea to wash your hands regularly. The other thing that happens, of course, is it gets us into the habit of washing our hands regularly for those of us who are not always at home. But yes, absolutely. If you really have that level of control over your home environment, then the most important times to wash your hands are when you come in contact with anything that is outside your home in which there could be virus. But even if you think about, for example, if there are two people living in a home and one of them goes outside, to work, to shop, whatever, and comes home, that person may not be feeling sick, but they may have the virus on their hands. They may touch something, and then the healthy other person may touch that same object, etc. And so it's not that easy to control your environment fully, which is another reason why regular hand washing is important.
Thank you. Dr. Alibai, my elderly parents are self-isolating in a small town in the US. We're perplexed in deciding whether we should bring them back to Canada or should we just let them stay in the US for now?
This is a great question, and it's a bit of a difficult one because there are other circumstances that would need to be considered. So, for example, do they have adequate healthcare insurance? Do they have all of their medications? How well are they in general? But the transportation from one city to another, first of all, how are they going to get there? Can they get there in a safe manner, or are they going to even be able to get there? For example, I know people who are stuck in other countries and they cannot fly back. US to Canada is a little bit easier, but there aren't that many flights, there aren't that many airports. So one has to look at the practical logistics. In terms of the risk of staying isolated elsewhere versus coming back, that's a difficult one. And I'm not sure I can give a blanket answer. I do know that when I have spoken to my colleagues and some of the experts in infectious diseases, if it's feasible to stay in the environment they're in and maintain the physical distancing and still be able to manage to get their groceries, to get their medications, make sure they're getting their health checks because some people need to see doctors on a regular basis, then it is probably better to stay in that environment. But for many people, that's not feasible. And so one needs to look at all of these factors. So it's a complex answer and it really depends. But these are some of the important factors that would need to be thought about.
Thank you. Dr. Sivji, how severe is COVID-19 in people who are asthmatic? Can you talk a little bit about those who have asthma, they're using puffers? There have been a couple of questions along those lines that have been received.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And as a respirologist, I have dozens and dozens and dozens of patients with asthma of all severity that I've been seeing over the last month. It is true that those with underlying lung disease and other chronic medical conditions are at increased risk of getting sick or sicker than someone without those conditions from COVID-19. However, the risk in people with asthma is much higher if they do not take their medications. And so the most important thing, if you are an asthmatic during this time, is number one, to try to avoid your triggers at all costs. So if you know what your triggers are, stay away from those triggers. Number two, take your maintenance medication and make sure you have enough of that. As Dr. Alibai mentioned, it's really important to make sure you have your medications. And number three, if you do end up getting a respiratory symptom, make sure you do reach out sooner than later to either your family doctor or if you're followed by a respirologist, your respirologist, so that an assessment and very good assessments can be done virtually. I know many offices are closed, but many places can do virtual assessments, and I've done many of them myself. And most of my asthmatics have done quite well. I've only had one needing to be hospitalized, and the rest have done quite well. And you certainly want to avoid people that are sick if you do have an underlying condition.
Thank you. Again, a question for Dr. Sivji. For individuals who are essential workers and they have to go out to work, does this virus survive on clothing? Should they be washing their clothes daily as soon as they get back home? What steps would you recommend? Maybe if you can even in general talk about how the virus survives on a variety of surfaces, because there's a lot of information out there on the length of time the virus survives on varying surfaces. So maybe if you could just touch on that as well while you answer this question.
Sure. So I mentioned in passing in my presentation that the average length of time that the virus lasts on a surface is 3.6 hours. We know that from experimental data in a lab under ideal circumstances. But real life is not a lab. In real life, there are a lot of variables that affect this, things like the porous nature of the surface. And so clothes would be quite porous. Clothes would absorb water out of the respiratory droplets, and the virus would die much quicker than 3.6 hours. Having said that, I know that when I either go to the hospital or talk to other people who go to the hospital regularly, they do have a separate set of clothes that they wear when they come home. So they will wear the greens or scrubs in the hospital. As soon as they get home, they'll change, put those clothes into the laundry and take a shower. So in theory, the virus can be on clothes, but the amount of virus that's on clothes in hospital workers is much higher than in the regular population. Now, what should the general population do when they get home from going outside? I think it depends on what you do. If you're walking around your block and not seeing anyone, that's probably low risk, and you come home, you wash your hands, and you're probably good to go. However, if you're going out for essential services, if you either work as an essential service worker that's not in a hospital, like in a pharmacy or a bank or something of that nature, or you're going grocery shopping and you know you're going to be around a lot of other people and surfaces that people have touched, it does make sense to come home, wash your hands, put on a fresh set of clothes, and then continue your day. Again, these are low risk scenarios, but you can, especially depending on who you live with and who else is in your household, you might want to do those small things to mitigate the risk even more.
If I can just add to that, I mean, I agree completely with Dr. Sivji said. I know that at our hospital, many of the experts are telling us, or not telling us, but many people who work there are also not only separating their clothes when they come home, but whoever's washing those clothes, whether it's that person or their spouse or whoever, just make sure that when they're handling those clothes, that they're washing their hands after that. Even though the risk is low and it disappears from clothing fairly quickly, it's one more strategy to remind ourselves of the importance of hand washing when coming into contact with anything that could be exposed to the virus, even the clothes that come into the home.
And can I add one last thing to that also? So
Sure.
I know a lot of healthcare workers have had this discussion because it is a very topical one. And they're even going to the extent, for the reasons mentioned by both Dr. Sivji and Dr. Alibai, of leaving their shoes either in the garage when they enter or by the front exit way, so that you're not bringing in those shoes, because we know the virus can stay on the surface. And for example, you go for an innocent walk, say somebody who walked with their child, once again, I'm talking the pediatric scenario, the kid's coughing, the kid has it, but is fine. And then you step on what the kid coughs on because the kid's less than 2 feet tall, and then it's on your shoes. So you don't want to be touching the soles of your shoes. Just leave them outside or in the garage when you enter your house. Thank
you. Got another text message again. Dr. Sivji, I know you talked a little bit about the survival of the virus on surfaces. The questioner is asking, can the virus spread through the ventilation system in the house? Let's say if I am sick and I lock myself in the basement, but my parents are upstairs, are they still at risk because there's the air that circulates within the house? Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have looked at lots and lots and lots of cases. There are 2.5 million people with this virus now. We've had a chance to study a lot of the transmission modes. It does not appear in an office setting or a home setting that there is transmission from floor to floor, building to building. And many of these buildings and homes do share the same HVAC systems. The only way that would happen is if the respiratory droplets were aerosolized, which means they have to be less than 50 microns in size. And in a hospital, that can happen because they are doing these things called aerosolized generating medical procedures like bronchoscopies or intubation, where they're putting a tube down the throat and hooking someone up to a breathing machine, or they're giving nebulized medications. And that is shown to have produced aerosolized or clouds, if you will, of respiratory droplets. In a home environment, it's not as much of an issue.
Thank you. There's a question about buying meat and chicken from the butcher's shop. Can we or should we disinfect the meat when we bring it in with, and the suggestion is apple cider vinegar or lime juice before we store it in the freezer? Maybe if Dr. Sivji, you can answer that question. In general, perhaps talk about the idea of disinfecting grocery supplies when you bring them into the house before you put them away.
So all of these questions fall under one category, and that category is what's called fomite transmission. Fomite is either a clothing or a package, or in this case, food that transmits a pathogen from one person to another. I think it's really important to emphasize here that fomite transmission is a drop in the bucket compared to transmission that happens between people that are within 6 feet of one another. And people who touch things with their hands without washing their hands and then touch their face. So I'm okay answering these questions, and I think these are important questions, but these are a minor source of transmission. It's very important to keep that in mind. I still order halal meat. I still get it. We have a delivery service. It's delivered to our home. We wash the meat. Of course, we wash our hands, and then we freeze it. I don't think that there's, in my opinion, that there's any need to disinfect the meat or put it in vinegar, as you've mentioned. But that's my opinion, and it's based on what I understand of the virology of this disease. I'll throw it open to my colleagues to see if they have a different opinion.
Dr. Alibai, Dr. Kamalia, did you want to add to that answer?
Sure, I'm happy to. I actually spoke to an infectious disease doctor about this exact issue today because one of my colleagues was asking me, and so the exact same answer that I think Dr. Sivji gave. In particular, my colleague pointed out that meat products are, of course, not eaten raw by any of us, and so the cooking will destroy or kill the virus if there's even any virus there. And so at the time you're touching the meat, hand washing, but after you've cooked it, if you've washed your hands and you've cooked it, there's basically no virus left. Also, there was a recent paper in a very prestigious medical journal that looked at how easy is it for the virus to stay alive in different animals, and in particular, among other animals, chicken and duck. And of course, we eat a lot of chicken in terms of the halal part. I don't think they studied cows, but in chicken in particular, the virus has a difficult time to stay alive. And so, for example, compared to, let's say compared to cats, which we don't eat, the virus, there's much less virus that can be alive in chickens, even when they're alive. And so there's even less virus to begin with. Once you've cooked it, it's basically all dead.
So I want to agree with both of them and also indicate that there's no studies I'm aware of that shows foodborne transmission of COVID-19. right? Once again, justifying that, yes, you can order meat, chicken from a butcher, follow good hand hygiene, cook it well, and you should be okay. I also want to mention just one thing. Dr. Noorani just messaged me, and he said that there is an IMI helpline for anybody who has any questions or requires health help, and that's 1-800-HELP. So 1-800-HELP, and it's a free helpline through IMI.
Thank you. Dr. Kamalia, a couple of questions for you. Firstly, can you talk a little bit again about why COVID-19 is less severe for children? And secondly, what are your recommendations for autistic children during self-isolation?
Okay, so I'll answer the first question. There's no specific evidence as to why COVID-19 affects children less severely. However, there are three theories. The easiest theory to understand for the general public is that we think children who are constantly in daycare and exposed to multiple viruses have probably been exposed to various forms of the COVID virus, because we know the coronavirus, because we do know that the coronavirus has been around for centuries. Just COVID-19 is a new form of this coronavirus. So one theory is that children have probably had some exposure in daycares, et cetera, throughout their lives, and so have built antibodies to the coronavirus and hence are less susceptible to COVID-19. In that line, it's also believed that children constantly get sick and are used to, their bodies are very used to dealing with high temperatures and high fevers. So they're more immune to that whole process and they seem to handle it better. Children are very resilient. So the belief is that perhaps that's one reason why they don't get so sick.
Sorry, Dr.
My apologies. That's the easy explanation for the general public. Then there's two more scientific explanations. And once again, these are theories because we can't really test them to verify their accuracies. But the two other theories are that the first thing is children don't have as well equipped an immune response. So one of the reasons why adults who get COVID-19 get very sick, and the adults that are in the ICU, it's known as the cytokine storm. And in order to have that, you need to have a fully mature immune system. Children generally don't have that, so they can't mount such a high immunological response or develop a cytokine storm. So that's another reason why kids don't get sick when they do contract COVID-19. And the final theory is that, as Dr. Sivji mentioned, talking about the virus itself, the virus needs a protein on the surface of a cell or a receptor to get into the cell, and that's what causes the problem. The coronavirus or the COVID-19 virus itself uses the ACE2 protein, and that's the angiotensin converting enzyme 2. So the belief is that children probably lack this enzyme or have very low amounts, particularly in their lower lungs, which is where the virus causes severe detriment with the ARDS symptoms and the respiratory compromise. Kids probably have a higher level of the ACE2 enzyme in their upper airways, and that's why they get those upper airway symptoms, which is that dry cough, the high fevers, etc. So those are the three theories that we believe that seem to be protecting children from contracting and getting very severe illness from COVID-19. Now, as to the second question, that's a little more difficult of a question, but essentially a child who has autism is not generally at higher risk of contracting COVID-19 and becoming sick from the pure mechanics of having autism. However, as you know, most autistic kids have very poor socialization skills, language skills, and so these kids would not quite be able to understand frequent hand washing, not touching their face, their eyes, their nose, their mouth. And so from an infectious control situation, these kids are at high risk because everything they touch, everything in their environment ends up in their face. Secondly, these kids are very tough to maintain in small and confined environments. So these kids generally do need areas of freedom and to go out. So once again, if you do have a child who has autism and you have a confined outdoor environment, like a backyard or an area where you can allow them to go outside and, you know, run around, let loose, I think that would probably be a great idea, because they can't be homebound with autism. They get very upset, etc. But I think as soon as they come indoors, you really have to make sure that you're hand washing them well, and sort of instilling these hygiene techniques into them, because I think that's their safest bet of not getting sick from the virus.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Alibhai. While it's not related to the COVID seminar that we have, the fact that Ramadan is around the corner, and there are questions with regards to fasting, especially amongst the elderly. There's a question that I've received that there's an individual who is type 2 diabetic, he's on insulin, blood pressure is okay, EGFR reading is 48, creatinine reading is 102. Can she fast? I think that's a very specific question, but if you can maybe talk about, if you want to answer that question, that's great, but maybe even talk a little bit in general about fasting, particularly because we're just days away from the month of Ramadan.
So I think I'd rather talk about the general situation rather than the specifics, because the specifics don't give me enough information, and I need a little bit more details to be able to answer with some of the nuances. But in general, when we're thinking about health issues for people who fast, it's not obviously just an issue for seniors. Dr. Siuji will be able to comment, Dr. Kamali will be able to comment. Healthy people can fast, but people with various chronic illnesses or who need medications to stabilize those conditions may be at increased risk and have to plan for the fasting and make sure that they plan out their day and night and space out their medications. Sometimes they need to take medications with such frequency, or they need to be eating regularly because of particularly unique organ systems, so that their stomach and the intestines work in certain ways, and they cannot, for example, just have 2 meals a day, and they need to eat small frequent meals. Then these individuals need to plan out how they can fast, and some of them cannot fast. It's not an issue of age alone. At the same time, of course, I know that as people get older, it becomes harder for people to fast. It becomes physically more demanding, and some people cannot do it. And so one needs to look at, not only are we able to fast from a medical perspective, but also are we able to fast from an aging perspective? Can the body take it? Sometimes people aren't sure. If you're not sure, you can speak to your health professional. But for example, there are people who are diabetic who need to take insulin. There's a lot of people with diabetes who need to take insulin or tablets to control their diabetes. And many times they can, in conjunction with their dietitian, their diabetes nurse educator, or their diabetes doctor, they can manage their diabetes medication regimen and change around the times that they take their medications, or the times that they inject themselves with insulin, or even the types of insulin in Ramadan that they might need. But some people cannot. It's not safe for them, and they simply are not able to fast. So there's many factors that need to be considered. But independent of all the medications, as people get older, it does become more difficult to fast, and it's a greater strain on the body. Sheikh Hasnain Qasim Ali just gave a talk yesterday to the seniors in the community about things to think about if they're going to fast. And one needs to really make sure that you're getting an adequate amount of fluid so you don't get dehydrated. And if you need to take water pills, those need to be adjusted in terms of timing, or you may even need to change the dose. So one needs to touch base with their healthcare professional, depending on what medications they're taking. But it's very important to wake up for Sahri and make sure that one drinks enough fluids and has enough food. And also that the types of food are carefully planned out so that we don't spend all our time eating lots of fried, unhealthy foods or eating extra ice cream, etc. You need to make sure you get a balanced diet, when in Ramadan it's a little bit harder because we're not eating as much. So all these factors need to be considered. There isn't a magic age at which we would say, you don't fast anymore. It's really very individual dependent. That being said, I find that in my practice, when managing Muslim patients who are fasting in Ramadan, and when looking at the literature on fasting, once you start to get into your late 70s and early 80s, a significant number of people are no longer able to fast. And by the time people get into their mid 80s or close to 90, very few people are able to fast the long fasts of Ramadan. And if they do fast them, they may fast one day and skip a couple of days and then fast again. And you know what? Allah is merciful, and there are many other ways in which one can get around the issue of fasting. One get exemptions. Some people will fast at other times of year. There's a fidya that can be paid instead, and you can still get many of the other blessings of Ramadan. But these are, in brief, some of the various considerations that need to be thought about.
Thank you. I think what stood out most in that response was no fried food and no ice cream.
Well, a little less of each. One can have them from time to time, but remember that they cannot take up a significant proportion of your diet or calories. So 10 to 15% of your calories, you may want to indulge in things that are a little more unhealthy, shall we say. But the vast majority of what we need to eat are healthy foods, including fruits and vegetables, animal or vegetable proteins, balanced carbohydrates, particularly complex carbohydrates, not simple refined white flour and white rice and things like that. There's many options for healthy eating. The problem is the most interesting foods tend to be the unhealthy ones that we all want to go after, especially if you've been fasting all day. But we have to be very careful and cognizant of that.
Thank you. I just want to clarify the phone number, the helpline that Dr. Kamalia shared earlier. I'll just repeat it one more time for those of you who didn't catch it. The helpline that is available from the IMI is 1-800-549-1007. Again, 1-800-549-1007. I'm conscious of the time. It's already 10:15. And so I don't want to prolong this session much longer. I recognize that there are still a number of questions that we have yet to answer, but being sensitive to the fact that it's already after 10 o'clock, we'll maybe tackle a couple of more questions. And all of the doctors that we have on the panel today are from our community and are available. If we have not been able to answer any of your questions and you want to reach out to us, we can redirect you to the physicians and help you get your questions answered. I do apologize in advance if we have not been able to get to your question, but I really do need to I'd like to get the session wrapped up within the next few minutes so that we can call it a night. Dr. Siuji, there are so many conflicting reports in the media concerning symptoms of COVID-19. Can you maybe recap one more time? What are the symptoms that one would have if they have COVID-19 at the beginning of the infection, somewhere in the middle, and then towards the end? If you can maybe just talk about the range of symptoms or the spectrum of symptoms from the time you get the infection to hopefully when you recover.
Yeah, I mean, the most general way to answer that is if you've ever had a bad flu, that's what you're going to feel like. The symptoms that come on with this virus are because of the immune response to the presence of the virus. And so what we've learned from following many of these patients is that commonly the typical symptoms, they call them, are fever, and in the adult population, not necessarily the senior population, but the adult population, it's a fever greater than 38 degrees Celsius, greater than 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, followed by dry progressive cough, which means not a tickle in your throat that goes away the next day, but a dry cough that gets worse. It's worse the night than it was during the day. It's worse the next morning than it was the night before. It's worse during the next day than it was in that morning. If you have that progressive cough, that's something to be concerned about. And then shortness of breath is another very common typical feature. Having said that, there's a whole host of other less common or atypical features. People have complained of muscle aches. People have complained of severe fatigue. People have complained of diarrhea. In talking to some of my ICU colleagues, people have presented with what's called delirium, where they're just confused and they don't know, they're not sure where they are. And that's been the presenting symptom. We've seen people present with migrainous type headaches. So there's a whole gamut of what we call atypical or unusual symptoms. But if you focus on the flu-like symptoms of fever, dry progressive cough, and shortness of breath, most people will have those. And again, most people have those about 5 days after they've been in contact and gotten the virus from someone else.
Thank you. So I'll take 2 more questions and then we'll call it a night. The first question is actually a question for both Dr. Alibhai and Dr. Kamalia. The question says that we have a baby that's due any time now, and we also have seniors at home. What precautions do you recommend that they should take while interacting with a child? Obviously, they will be going to the hospital for delivery. So if you can, Dr. Kamalia, maybe talk a little bit about that, as well as Dr. Alibhai. And then the last question that I'll ask will be for Dr. Suji.
So Shabir, are you okay if I start off?
Please go right ahead.
Okay, so remember that the newborn infant will not contract COVID-19 from the mother, even if the mother is infected. So the newborn infant in general should not be infected unless they had some outbreak in the floor or the ward that the newborn infant was born in. So given that, because that's a very low risk situation, certainly there hasn't been a case reported yet of any new nursery with a COVID-19 outbreak, the newborn infant should come home pretty safe from having the virus. As such, the newborn is not at risk to the grandparents who the baby lives with. So I think from that perspective, there's no concerns with the grandparents being in contact with the newborn infant because they all cohabit within the same house. Having said that, newborn babies are very commonly get nasal congestion, runny nose, and from that perspective, because those can be similar to the features or symptoms of COVID-19, the grandparents have to be incredibly cautious with maintaining the hygiene we discussed, with the hand washing, not kissing the baby on any of the orifices, trying to keep some sense of a distance, washing their hands. And I'll take it a step further, and Dr. Alibhai, please feel free to correct me. It might be wise for the grandparents to wear a mask for some of the duration when they're around the newborn, especially while the newborn has symptoms that could be of nasal congestion. It's hard to identify. So once again, I don't think there should be an issue if they cohabit, that for them to be around the baby, but I think you just have to really be far more cautious and careful than they would have had we not been, in this situation of the COVID-19 outbreak right now.
I mean, I agree with all of the recommendations you made, Dr. Kamalia, including being careful around the baby for the grandparents, particularly that they don't infect the baby. The grandparents also need to be aware, particularly if they go outside at all, that they need to monitor their own symptoms, their own health, to make sure they don't have any symptoms. Because if they have any symptoms suggestive of any infection, they need to make sure that they keep their distance from other members of the family wherever it's possible, while they're monitoring to make sure that those symptoms are not progressing in a way that might be, in fact, COVID-19. The only other angle that I'll bring up here is the mother, not the grandparents or the child, but the pregnant woman who went to the hospital, assuming that the delivery was in the hospital, and was exposed to an environment where there is an increased risk. And unless the mother, from my understanding and from the guidelines as I understand them, and others can correct me if they have a different understanding, if she was in a ward where there's no known or suspected exposure to someone with COVID-19 infection, then people just need to practice the usual precautions at home with careful hand washing, and everybody needs to monitor for symptoms. Where it gets trickier is if she had an exposure potentially to someone who had COVID-19 infection, let's say in a shared room, on the maternity ward, etc., then the situation becomes more complicated. And it's not that the grandparent should avoid the grandchild who delivered, and she should really be in isolation from them for up to 14 days if she's been exposed.
So I'm just going to add to that. Given that scenario, which is probably not a highly likely one, but certainly a very possible one, remember then that the mother will be exposing herself to her child. And if she's not following good hygiene, as I've discussed, then she'll expose the child to the infection, and the child in turn can still affect the grandparents. So there can be a bit of a domino effect, but I think what we're both trying to say is the chances, given, a situation where there's no outbreak in the maternity floor, no outbreak in the nursery, which, like I said, I don't think I've heard of either, the grandparents should be okay to come in contact with the grandchild, to enjoy the grandchild, but just really maintain a higher level of respiratory hygiene, hand hygiene, etc. And should anyone develop any kind of symptoms, they should seek medical attention immediately.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you, both Dr. Kamalia and Dr. Alibhai. Before I sort of read out the last question for Dr. Sivji, I should mention that some of the questions that we have not been able to answer this evening were actually answered in a similar seminar we had a couple of weeks ago with 3 other physicians. And that session is available online. So if you haven't gotten an answer to your question and you want to refer to the other session, some of these questions were in fact answered in the earlier seminar that we did have. So the final question I have is for Dr. Sivji. As a trusted health expert in the community, how would you advise the board of directors to begin transitioning, reopening the mosque? And I can assure you, Dr. Sivji, that this isn't a question that I've planted. So the question is, will the transition of reopening the mosque be gradual? Will it be based on age? What do you expect to share with the task force in terms of your advice to start reopening the center?
That's it's funny that you say that, because our webinar this evening overlapped a little bit with our task force meeting, as you know, and I was going to bring that up. In my role as medical director for large organizations, this is the question of the hour: is what is recovery, what is reactivation, what is reinstitution of life as it used to be look like? And I think that it's going to require a lot of understanding, and it's going. The best description I have heard of this is it's like walking down a mountain in the dark. So every step has to be taken carefully, or else it could be very treacherous. But obviously, we do need to reopen the economy. We do need to reopen the masjid at some point. And I think what we'll see is we'll do it in stages. My recommendation will likely be that we think about what programs are going to allow us to have physical distancing, which programs are going to allow us to have smaller gatherings at first, and see how that goes. And this will have to be done with lots of surveillance and lots of monitoring to see what happens, not just inside the center, but in York region in general, as things open up in parallel. And if, like I said at the beginning, if the numbers seem to be still stable or on the decline, then we open it up to the next level, and then we open it up to the next level. But all along, monitoring, walking down that mountain in the dark, one step at a time. That's the best I think I can say at this point.
Thank you. Before I wrap up, Dr. Alibhai, Dr. Kamalia, did you want to add anything to Dr. Sivji's response?
I think the only thing I would add is that if we are going to have a phased approach to reintroducing people back to the masjid, which I think is very reasonable, one of the groups that will be at the end, unfortunately or fortunately, will have to be the seniors. Given their increased risk, they are the ones I think we would last want to bring to the masjid when we are really confident that their risk of getting sick is low and acceptable, so that other groups who are lower risk of getting infection and low risk of having severe infection would be the ones that would be coming to the masjid sooner.
And in addition, I think when we do integrate the seniors, normally, little kids will go running to them. I think you have to be a little more cautious with kids who, may have a little bit of a runny nose, coughing, sneezing, coming and hugging and kissing the seniors. So for the short period after we reintroduced and reopened our masjids, etc. I think we always have to be a little more cautious with social contact with each other.
Thank you. On behalf of the community, I would like to thank the doctors for being with us this evening. As difficult as the times are for us, we cannot begin to fully appreciate what it's like to be on the front lines. We're grateful to you and your colleagues for all that you do. May the Almighty continue to protect you as you serve humanity through this crisis. And Mu'mineen, we hope you found the session this evening to be informative. Please continue to remain safe and healthy by diligently following the recommendations from the public health authorities. Wassalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.